if my value, how I see myself, my self-worth is attached to what can I do or how gifted I am, then, in a situation where the gifts that I have are particularly needed, I'm probably prone to pride. And then in the situations where my gifts are not deemed as important, I fall into envy, or even farther away, like I'm envious of what other people have, but I also start to get this image of myself that I'm not worth anything. Welcome back to the Journey Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler.
And I'm Abigail.
And no Dylan today, but that's all right. Today we're going to be talking about envy, particularly envy as it relates to other people's talents and their abilities, and just generally that feeling that we can all fall into sometimes of wanting to be somebody else or wanting to have what somebody else has.
Yeah.
Your life, your journey starts now.
How often do you feel envious of other people?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I guess to some degree you could say all the time, and then it really just depends. I think in my life, throughout different seasons of my life, I've been in, I've been envious of different things about other people, whether that's their athletic ability when I was younger, or them doing better than me in school or something like that, or their family getting to do fun things that my family didn't get to do.
Yeah.
And then as I've gotten older and gotten into like professional life, this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but people who work for the church, people who are pastors, are just as broken and struggle as much as everybody else. And so there have been times where it's like you hear a really great sermon and you think, man, I wish I could preach like that. Just little things where, and sometimes bigger things, but I think kind of core to that envy is I wish I had the things that they had. Not even necessarily the physical things, material things, but more like, I wish I could be as talented as them in this area. I wish that I was as strong as them at this particular skill. And I think that's something that we all can kind of fall into, because some gifts seem to be elevated in the way that we look at what makes someone gifted compared to others. And so, I don't know, it seems like sometimes the gifts that are the most attractive, people who are go-getters, people who are type A, which admittedly I am like that most of the time, but I think the downside is that we can get this idea of ourselves that if I'm not as good as this person at this specific thing, then I'm just not good at all, or I don't have any talents. There's nothing good about me. I don't have anything to offer, when I don't really think that that's true.
I think also what ties into what you're talking about is, let's say you're a mixing pot. Like, you have some very good talents that are desirable to the world and some that are not so desirable. And so when and one thing I've noticed in myself, and I've also noticed in other people, is that people who tend to be more insecure and envious, when they, for any reason, if there is a specific talent that they have that becomes desirable, or somebody sees something in them, for example, maybe intelligence that had grown over a couple of years, they put that on a pedestal, and then because of the envy that's in their heart, it builds pride, and then you start looking at yourself from a higher angle, and so you look down on other people, and so it's a cycle of, then you feel like you're not good enough, but then, I am good enough, and I almost am too good. And so I think the envy creates this cycle that is really, really unhealthy, because you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, and sometimes it feels good because maybe you're better, and that is not going to get you where you want to go, because there's always going to be someone who's better.
Right. When you attach your value as a person to what you can contribute, and not, for example, who God made you to be, or just the fact that God calls you his child, then we start to put ourselves in a position to be really vulnerable to that kind of up and down, back and forth that you talked about, where if my value, how I see myself, my self-worth is attached to what can I do or how gifted I am, then, in a situation where the gifts that I have are particularly needed, I'm probably prone to pride. And then in the situations where my gifts are not deemed as important, I fall into envy, or even farther away, like I'm envious of what other people have, but I also start to get this image of myself that I'm not worth anything, that I'm no good to anybody because I'm not as musically inclined as that person, or I'm not as outgoing as that person, or I'm not as good of a public speaker as that person. And so I think when when envy, when it comes to gifts and abilities, starts to determine our value, we fall into this place of like constant fluctuation back and forth, being tossed back and forth by just the winds of whatever's going on in our surroundings and our social circles.
In a practical sense, how would you stop that pattern?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that I encourage, that I, kind of talked about before, was first determining where you find your value. Even if you're not a believer, being able to find value in things that are not contingent upon your productivity or your ability in a given area, but just contingent upon who you are as a human being. So how do you fight against envy? I think the big question is, how do you fight against envy? When you see, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, or whatever, whether you have no idea what you are in terms of your gifting, how do we push back against looking at other people's giftings and feeling like if we can't do what they do, then we have no value?
I think there's a quote that I really like. It's comparison is the thief of joy. And in comparison, we know we can categorize as a thought. And so if you're constantly comparing yourself to other people or others to yourself, then that means you're in a pattern of thinking constantly about other people. So then I'd say to stop doing that, to kind of, in a practical sense, strive away from envy, is to not get, well, for one, don't get so angry at yourself that you are now constantly even more reminded of what you're thinking
your
about.
Own shortcomings or perceived shortcomings, even if they're not real.
Yeah. I'd say, because one of the things that's just really hard to do is, like, the mind is such a weak thing. Like, you can't use the mind to control the mind. And so let's say, for example, I'm really envious of another person. Maybe it's for their intelligence. And whenever I see them, I'm like, oh, that person's so intelligent. Like, I'm just not good enough. Like, they got that grade and I got this grade. And so now you're in this strain of, thinking about it. And the first thing I'd say that people would probably come to was like, I just need to stop thinking about it. And so now you're removing a thought, but now you have that empty space there, and it's hard you actually have to fill that space. So if you want to pull away from comparison and pull away from thinking those thoughts, you have to add in something. So I'd say start just focusing on something better. You get creative. There's a lot of different ways you can stop thinking about something, and that's by thinking about something else. So I'd probably just start with, in my personal opinion, that if I wanted to stop comparing myself, I would focus on the things that I am good at. And it's a habit. Like, you're not just going to be good at it right away. You have to build that up.
Yeah, train your brain.
Yeah, and so one thing I am good at is I'm good at drawing. So whenever I see that person and I think, oh, I'm not as intelligent as them, maybe I'll focus on looking at the images on my phone that I drew.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's not even you're not saying I'm a better drawer than that person who's intelligent. Yeah. You're just saying, I just am good at drawing. You're
not even thinking of them.
Right.
Start focusing on, what you can do.
Right. Yeah, it's difference between a weakness-based and a strength-based perspective, which is actually one of the things that's core to the journey coaching model. Is instead of focusing on what you can't do, we all do have to acknowledge what our challenges and limitations are, the ways that we fall short. But if you start with, here's what I can do, it's actually much easier to then self-motivate to go out and to do things that are productive and contributing to society. And, regardless of whether or not you are the best athlete or the most musically talented person, like, there is something about you specifically that is needed. Like there's a reason that you're here. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the traps I think that we can get into, even talking about intelligence, is we only think of intelligence as, do you get a good grade in school? And one of the chapter on strengths in the Journey book actually talks about the multiple intelligences theory, where some people are verbal linguistic, like they're word smart. These people who are good at English, they might be authors or something like that. Logical, mathematical intelligence, numbers, reasoning. They might be an engineer, or they do really well in math class. And so if those two have a lot to do with school. And so if you're younger, regardless of what you're doing, if you're not high in one of those two intelligence areas, the temptation, I think, or the envy can be to say, I wish I was as smart as them. When
Mm-hmm.
it's like, we got to reframe that entire question of like, am I smart enough to, it's not that I'm not as smart as them, it's just I'm smart in a different way. And there's some in here I never even would have thought about before, like intrapersonal intelligence, like being very self-aware, being self-smart.
Yeah.
Like, man, you could be the best mathematician in your school, but if you don't know yourself, if you don't know, how to get the best out of yourself, then you could very well struggle at a lot of things. And so one of the things that I think, one of the important qualities for us to have when we talk about what are my strengths and how do I not envy someone else's strengths, the ability to understand that there's different kinds of smarts, there's different kinds of gifts, and then recognize that each of them has value, each of them has something that it can contribute, and that if everybody had the same gift, we would struggle. Like
Yeah.
nothing would get done. And so I think about, even like within the office that I work in at our church, I'm a big picture guy. I like to think of big ideas and big plans, and I can, help cast a vision and things like that. I'm not great with the details. And so when I have big ideas, I'll just run them by our two secretaries, because, our administrative staff, because they are detail people. They're great
They know
at
how to
making
like
sure
get
the
it
day to
done.
day.
Yeah.
And so they'll say, well, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And so we've had big church things, big initiatives that we've done in youth ministry that would have fallen on their face because I would have completely not considered a detail,
Yeah.
if we didn't have those people in the community who I could go to and say, help me see in my blind spots, the things that I'm not naturally good at doing that you are good at doing. How can you help me, and how can I help you, so
Yeah.
that we can together be successful? In my case, in a church, that's where I happen to work. But I think that's true across the board. If we all had the same gift, nothing would be getting done.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've been getting a lot better at, and it's honestly a habit of thinking better thoughts, is I've had a paradigm shift, and I'm not entirely sure where to pinpoint it down to exactly how I got to this point. But I've started seeing, like, looking at people in a different light. Um, and I've noticed that not everyone has all the intelligences like listed out right here. There's
Well, I don't think anyone has all of them.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't,
Jesus, but
yeah, it wouldn't be possible. But what I've noticed is that, even when I look at people who the world wouldn't deem as intelligent, I can pinpoint a thing that they're extremely good at that many, many people are not. And I'm in awe of that. And I think that's incredible. And I think when people recognize that, you have gifts and you have talents that maybe the world doesn't see as desirable. And I think that is it's so sad, because there's so much potential in each and every one of us that we don't even want to look at our gifts because we think that they're, shameful, or they're not good enough. And so those gifts are not growing. If you don't look at your strengths and your weaknesses, you can't grow your strengths, and you can't leave your weaknesses in the dust. Like, you have to shine, you have to look in the mirror. And even like I've been thinking about this, like, recently I've been kind of struggling, like, with the strengths and the weaknesses things, because I've started, looking at my weaknesses, and it gets to the point where I forget some of my strengths. And so I'm super aware of my weaknesses, and it's honestly like a balance. Like, you want to keep your strengths in your mind and work on on a few weaknesses so that you have enough energy. You can feel so depleted if you're constantly focusing on your weaknesses. And I think that once people recognize and see where their strengths are at and see and focus on them and see the potential that can happen there, even if it isn't desirable to the world, I think that the world would be a beautiful place, in my opinion.
Right. Right. And one of the reasons it's maybe not considered desirable is just because people don't know about it yet.
Yeah.
If it's kept in the dark, there's no way for people to consider it desirable until
Yeah.
they see it, until they experience that, and then come to understand that actually everybody
Yeah.
has something about them that's
something I've
good.
noticed, that people think something is weird, and then once it grows and people start to like it more, something that was weird 10 years ago
Yeah.
is now
Oh.
crazy popular.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, even when I was a kid, if you said, I want to play video games professionally, that would be weird.
Yeah.
Now there are people who make a lot of money doing that.
Yeah.
It's like, that is a very specific kind of like talent or ability that I don't have personally, but people are making a living off of it. I'm sure there's some downsides to it like everything else, but there's upside to it. People are making a living, and it's a form of entertainment. And, I'm sure I don't know, maybe do charitable initiatives like what the NFL does or the NBA does. But, that kind of idea where, yeah, that would have been a crazy thing to say even 15 years ago. But now, there's all kinds of it. And so I think it's important also, you mentioned something really important. You have kind of trained your brain to look for what's unique and special about individual people. And as you do that, I would guess that it actually also helps you to look at yourself and say, what do I contribute?
Yeah.
Like what's unique and good about me? I can look at it and I can see it in other people, and I don't have to be envious of anybody because I recognize that everybody has something unique about them that's valuable, that's a strength, and that the same is true of Abigail, and that the same is true of me. Like, I might not have what somebody else has, but I do have something worthwhile. I do have a strength just like everybody else does.
I think that like what you said, shines light to even what's very, very important is that the relationship you have with yourself is the relationship you'll have with other people. Actually, what came first in that pattern was I actually saw, and I chose it. I don't even know like where this came from, but one day I was like, I want to look at myself and actually see like the potential that's there. And so I chose to look at the unique parts that I thought were special that maybe weren't so desirable to the world. And what the consequence of that was that actually happened, where I started looking at other people that way too.
Yeah.
And so I think that just shows the relationship you have with yourself is the relationship you're going to have with other people. And so you want to make sure you're on good terms with your own mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if your life is characterized by envy, wanting what other people have, then your life is also going to be characterized by like an inability to be genuinely happy for people.
Yeah.
An
because you'll always be empty. Like, you're never going to have enough.
Right. And so it's like that's going to harm your relationships with other people, because if I'm just thinking about what I don't have all the time, what I wish I had that someone else does have, then
That's sad.
yeah, and when someone else does something good, I won't be able to honestly think like, oh, I'm so happy for them.
Oh, yeah.
It'll just be, man, I wish I had what they just had. I wish that thing that happened to them or that achievement they just made, I wish I could have done that. I wish I could have gotten that.
Yeah, and you'll hope disaster on other people.
Right.
That's
yeah.
really sad.
Absolutely. Like, oh, I wish that something bad would happen to you so that something good could happen to me. It's like, well, that's just not. It's not actually how the world works. Like, we can all be doing well together at the same time. That should be the goal, you know. And so I think you're right about that. And of course, envy is not something that you have or you don't have. It's kind of like being hungry, like you might not be hungry right now, but you never know when that hunger pang is going to strike up, when you're going to have to battle against that. And so I think continuing to cultivate or to grow some habits of being grateful for the strengths that you have, and trying to focus on how you can use those for the benefit of other people, the benefit of the world at large. That, and then, as that leads to finding the good in other people, finding their strengths and what makes them unique, I think the more that you do that, the easier it will be to fend off those momentary flashes of envy that might sneak up on you when you see somebody who is, really attractive, or is really good at something that you wish you could be good at, or that just had some real success in their life. You don't feel the need to be envious of that. You don't have to kind of go back into your shell of, well, I'm no good, or there's nothing good about me. I can't do anything for anybody else, because you already have a strong foundation on, no, I was made uniquely. I was made fearfully and wonderfully, and there are things about me that are good and that are strong and that I can use to benefit people, to benefit myself, even in a way that's not selfish. And so the more that you kind of stand on that strong foundation, I think the easier it is to fight off some of those moments when you are tempted to fall into envy.
Yeah.
Well, if you're somebody who struggles at times to understand what are your gifts, or what are the things that about you that are unique that can be used to benefit the world, to benefit the people around you, to be used as a way to glorify God, we encourage you, just grab one of the books over at journeycoaching.org, and by the second or third session, you'll already be talking about your strengths and your intelligences, and just what it is about you that makes you unique and wonderful. So grab a book, grab a friend or a coach, and dive in.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and make sure you like and subscribe. Visit us at journeycoaching.org and check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Start your own journey at journeycoaching.org.
Your life, your journey starts now.